Дорогие друзья, 22 декабря 2021 года состоялось торжественное открытие первого представительства Санкт-Петербургского государственного университета в Федеративной Республике Германия в онлайн-формате. Предлагаем вашему вниманию лекцию Татьяны Владимировны Черниговской «Brain and Mind». В своей лекции доктор наук, профессор и директор Института когнитивных исследований СПбГУ рассматривает поиски смысла относительно молодой междисциплинарной наукой нейролингвистикой. Что делает человека человеком? Что выделяет его среди других существ? Что такое язык? В своем выступлении Татьяна Черниговская ставит эти и другие вопросы, опровергая популярное сравнение, что человеческий мозг подобен компьютеру, и предлагая взглянуть на мозг как на семиотическое пространство, создающее информацию. Полную версию церемонии смотрите на официальном YouTube-канале СПбГУ, перейдя по ссылке в описании к этому видео.
Уважаемые друзья, уважаемые коллеги, сейчас я хотел бы объявить о начале лекции доктора биологических и филологических наук, директора Института когнитивных исследований Санкт-Петербургского университета Татьяны Владимировны Черниговской на тему Brain and Mind. Уважаемые коллеги, прошу запустить лекцию Татьяны Владимировны. Спасибо.
Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, my talk will be in English, and its topic is Brain and Mind, and its subtopic is Neuroscience Search for Meaning. My field is Cognitive Science. It's a modern interdisciplinary field which includes several domains. It is philosophy, linguistics, anthropology, neuroscience, artificial intelligence, and experimental psychology. Some more, of course, but these are the main. I'll start with Francis Bacon, who centuries ago wrote a very important thing. The logic now in use serves rather to fix and give stability to the errors which have their foundation in commonly received notions, than to help the search for truth. So it does more harm than good. It's a very important statement for us, in spite of the fact that it was written long ago. It is still actual and becoming more and more actual. Stephen Jay Gould, in his very interesting book, Wonderful Life, wrote what he saw as the unlikelihood for our existence. He wrote about the creature that you see on the screen and that lived about 500 million years ago and who survived the Cambrian extinction. And it's a happy event for us because it's the predecessor of entire phylum Chordata, including vertebrates and, of course, us. Gould wrote that it fills him with a new kind of amazement. Our evolution had to channel in a certain direction to come to anthroposemiotic behavior. It's changing vocal tract, middle ear, it was changing diet, it increased the brain size, it changed our semiotic behavior, it invented cross-motor neuronal change, greater tool use, and some other things that led us to anthroposemiotic behavior. In 1970, a film of a famous director, François Truffaut, which was called L'Enfant Sauvage, appeared on the screens, and it was an adaptation from the real event of the 18th century, which is depicted in writings of Dr. Jean Itard. And it is about a boy who came from the woods and who looked like a human being but presumably wasn't, because he had no social or verbal experience. It was a kind of a Mowgli example. And then a discussion started that continues till now, to become human. Is it enough to have a human genome? Or you also need an adequate social development, both verbal and behavioral. We humans have large brains and very large frontal lobes, but we are not the only who have large brain and huge frontal lobes. Look at elephants or dolphins or gorillas. Look at different types of brain, like those from the crows, which has a different organization, giving an amazing result of very high intelligence. So not only frontal lobes, but larger amount of neurons in these parts of the brain. When we compare human brain with those of other mammals, we look for certain items like encephalization quotient, thickness of neocortex, size of frontal lobes, as I've said already, and energetic cost per gram. Homo sapiens is a polytypical group. We have different ancestors, like Neanderthals, like Homo altaensis, or in other words, Homo denisova, and many others that are being excavated almost every month, and that give enormous and very precious materials for paleogenetics. So we now know that we have many very different ancestors, and our genome is not only that of a Homo sapiens. In our brain, which is enormous, we have 86 billions of neurons and 10 times more glia or glial cells. We have a quadrillion of synaptic connections. And when I look at pictures like the one that you see on the screen, I cannot understand how information can come from point A to point B using such a network. We are the symbolic species. And the important thing is that we came from here and now that is adequate for mental processes of our neighbors from the planet, of other animals. We came to there and then. We look into the future. Homoloquens, this is who we are, but it's not only about words. Language is much more than a communication process. When we look at connecting roads in the brain, it's important to see what is depicted as a yellow hook on the slide, and it's a so-called ventral language stream. This hook subserves meaning. It subserves semantics of language. It's a very important thing because, as far as we know, no other creature living on our mutual planet has this kind of connection. So we have a special connecting hook that subserves meaning. Now we know that human mind is not a Turing machine, as we were sure it was. Its principles are not based on stimulus-reaction scheme. Rather, our mind extracts faces and objects, relevant features, revealing specific and unusual features. It is not linear and stable. The brain is not just processing information. Rather, it creates meaning. It creates the worlds. Christoph Koch, who was a president and chief scientific officer of the Allen Brain Institute, wrote that finding out what the detailed differences are between the mouse and the human brain will help us understand what makes us unique among species. It needs comment. For many decades, science perceives brain and mind as a kind of bio-automatic tool. However, it is very complex, and it gets information from the world, processes it, and gives reactions. What we still do is continue collecting finds from the bottom. The more atomic, the better, and we hope that the final construction will evolve by itself from a set of neurons, their ensembles, functional zones, and finally from neural nets or hypernets. Ethic rules prohibit us to have hard experiments with the human brain. Therefore, we all agree, and it's an error, that we can take the data from simpler quotes, systems of other animals, increase in volumes, even include some additional designs, and get a result that can be transposed to human mind characteristics. And I insist on the fact that it's an erroneous and a misleading view. Human mind is that of a human. Human ability to create totally new worlds using only strength of mind and thought, this is what differs us from other neighbors on the planet. And not just additional billions of neurons, not hypernets and cognitomes, the peaks of our evolution. All these cannot be studied by multiplication of technical characteristics of units and rules from other species. Nobel Prize winner Gerald Edelman, in his theory of neuronal group selections, argued that the neurons in the brain wire themselves up in complex and idiosyncratic patterns during the growth and then the experience. No two people are wired the same way. This is a very important thing. No two people, I repeat, are wired the same way. The neurons do come to compose a number of structures. They form groups which tend to fire together. Groups tend to fire together. And for Edelman, these groups are the bases that are operating in the brain. These are the units of the brain, not neurons themselves, but the groups of neurons that fire together. He opposes to the idea that the brain is a computer, so I can only agree with him. Edelman insists on great importance of higher order processes. And he speaks of concepts that are maps of maps, and they arise from the brain's recategorizing its own activity. Concepts by themselves only constitute primary or first-order consciousness. Human consciousness also features secondary consciousness, concepts about concepts. It deals with language and the concept of the self, and all this built on the foundation of first-order concepts that we deal with looking at animals and their behavior. Our main feature is also language, and language is a communication instrument, of course, but much more. It is a tool for thinking. We have several symbolic languages: verbal, the language of mathematics, the language of music, and visual, including body languages. Language organization in the brain is still being a hot pot in all the discussions. The main issues are on your screen. It's a discussion about whether language is a domain-specific versus domain-general process. Is it organized in modules, or it's a huge a huge map of connections? Cognitive and linguistic abilities, are they independent or they have reciprocal evolution? These discussions never end. It's important to note that all verbal languages have some mutual specific features independent of a concrete national language. We all have phonology, recursion in syntax, universal features, probably innate and genetically based. We have a huge context dependence, changing meaning following the background of the writer or speaker and the reader or listener. All happens online, very quick, every time, every moment. No stable fixed meanings of items. This is what amazes me. How do we manage to deal with a world that is changing every moment? We have clouds or semantic clusters of some prototypes or concepts. Some, more general, are probably inborn. And I refer to wonderful papers of Jerry Fodor. Even the borders are not stable, and they are rather subjective. So language is a very complex code. Ludwig Wittgenstein, a wonderful philosopher, linguist, and thinker, he introduced the metaphor of a carpet. He argues that every reader draws out his own thread out of this carpet, a text. And it shows us a fundamental observer dependence. If you have no concept, you have no understanding of what you register, of what you read or listen to. You need a concept to understand a dialogue. To deal with other minds, we should have the shared context, definitely based on compatible or more or less compatible embodied cognition. To minimize ambiguity and non-transparency causing communicational collapse, which we deal with very often, one should think of bridging the potential gaps between human beings and other minds, animate or artificial. Artificial is becoming more and more important now. because of quickly developing artificial intelligence programs. To deal with other minds, we should have mutual cultural background. Modern science, as in previous centuries, is still a third-person science. A third-person investigator, like me for instance, lives and works as if the world does not include him or her. We face a paradox. The brain is in the world. However, the world is in the brain because we create that world. A striking discrepancy between first and third person experience. This is what we have. Can qualia is first person experience, can it be transferred to others, to artificial intelligence, for instance? What for do we need correlates of consciousness? If not for clinics. In clinics, of course, it's evident. But if to think of other spheres, what do we need correlates for? Correlation is not a causation. It is just a correlation, nothing more. What are the necessary and sufficient requirements to have consciousness? Do we need a brain for that? Do we need a body for that? We deal with embodied cognition. We humans have embodied cognitions. When we start thinking of some other creatures, including our neighbors from the planet or extraterrestrial types of life, or artificial life, as in artificial intelligence, what about that? Our genius classical scholars, Sechenov and Pavlov, by the way, professors of St. Petersburg State Universities, started thinking for it long ago. And they wrote wonderful things. And I also think that they were afraid of the problem because it is so complex and multidisciplinary, and we don't know how to approach to it. We still do not know. I also want to show you the picture of Ivan Pavlov and Leon Arbeli, one more classic of physiology and even of evolutionary physiology, who worked in St. Petersburg. So I'm presenting you classical scholars of our St. Petersburg scientific space. I also want to show you Vladimir Bekhterev, again working here. And I want to stress that in 1888, Bekhterev gave an assembly talk in Kazan University. The talk was called Consciousness and Its Limits. And there, Vladimir Bekhterev developed the conception of unconscious, which was 3 years before Sigmund Freud, by the way. But the idea was not understood by the public, not only by wide public, but by scientific audience also. Alexei Ukhtomsky was a professor of St. Petersburg University. He was a wonderful scholar, a genius too, not accepted adequately then. But now we see that he was looking into a very different direction, which became so actual now. He wrote, "There is no object without a subject, and there is no subject without an object. We are not the viewers," he wrote. "We are the participants of the being. Our behavior is work. Our nature is being made. Nobel Prize winner Niels Bohr, a Nobel Prize for Physics, showed us long ago that quantum physics accepts that an observer is a part of a scientific paradigm. So third-person experience is not an adequate model for science since then. The data are not theory-free, and thus they depend on our mind. They depend on the observer. The observer is a scholar. Brain and mind should be studied by interconnection of natural sciences, arts, and other humanities. Cognitive sciences will never experience paradigmatic increase that we need so much now without looking at the problem from a different perspective in the context of the products of the human genius. So mind and consciousness, this is what we humans have. Can we catch it? Can we catch concepts? Information coming to us from the external world is always ambiguous. How do people manage to overcome this uncertainty and process the changing world, quickly changing world, considering that not only its inherent characteristics change, but also the state of the person perceiving the information. So it's not a stable space. It's a very quickly changing something. Linear approach to such complex phenomena is irrelevant. Paradigmatic shift is inescapable. We are looking for it. When we deal with causation, not only correlation, we deal with time. But what is time? Is it a dimension? Is it a physical event? Is it a brain function? Let's look centuries ago and read what St. Augustine wrote on the nature of time. He wrote, "The past cannot exist because it has come and gone. The future cannot exist because it has not yet to arrive. The present has no extension and cannot be measured. In what sense, then, the time is real? Time is real in at least one way, in our minds. The future exists insofar as we anticipate it. The past exists because we have memory. As far as the present is concerned, it is but a fleeting moment, and it is always passing. Therefore, it can be said that we are always living in the present. So, do we still have a concept of time? By the way, some 2 weeks ago, I came across a paper on quantum physics. It shows that in a quantum world, the time goes forward and it goes backward at the same time. Doesn't it shows us that there is no time in a quantum world? And quantum world is here. It's not in a different galaxy. It's in our finger. And some scholars, some artists have understood it long ago, like here. Ivan Sechenov, our famous classic in physiology, wrote an amazing thing in the end of the 19th century. From a procedural perspective, there is not a slight difference between a real event and its consequences and the recollection about it. So, for our brain, there is no difference between what we live in, what we remember about, and what we have just produced. It's amazing that he wrote such important things so long ago, when science didn't have fantastic instruments that we have now, like EEG, evoked potentials, and tomography of different kinds. He simply could not know it. How did he manage to produce such a formula? We produce arts, don't we? We produce poetry. And what is poetry? Poetry is a verbal activity, isn't it? But it's not just words. Joseph Brodsky, a Nobel Prize winner in literature, wrote for his Nobel lecture, and later he repeated it in some of his essays. He wrote the following: "Poetry is not a form of entertainment, and in a certain sense, not even a form of art, but our anthropological, genetic goal, our linguistic, evolutionary beacon. It is also a highly economical form of mental acceleration." Imagine wonderful things, very strange for a poet. As a tool for cognition, poetry beats any existing form of analysis, beats any existing forms of analysis. In other words, what a poem, or more accurately, the language itself, it tells you, be like me. What is music? Music is not a physical sound. Like mathematics and poetry, music makes us human. When we think of these wonderful people who created music for us, how did they do it? They didn't deal with physical sounds, did they? You can borrow tools from arts to study brain mechanisms. Alfred Schnittke, a wonderful genius composer who lived in Russia, and later years of his life he lived in Germany. He wrote, "To develop a pearl in a seashell, you need something irrelevant, a lion, a grain of sand. The same is in arts. Truly great is born out of rules." It's a very important statement. Truly great is born out of rules. Now I know, he wrote, that errors, in quotes, errors, or using rules on the verge of risk is just the zone where life-giving elements of art evolve. And I'm adding to it, not only of arts. It's an adequate formula for science too. Risky approaches or errors. This is what gives us wonderful effects. Neuroscience shows us important things for understanding human creativeness. We have so-called anti-correlated networks, a balance of specific temporal circuit of dynamic brain activity. We know that there is so-called the default mode network, and it's internally directed and correlates with consciousness of self, autobiographical memory, imagination, and self-referencing. The dorsal attention network is an externally directed system that correlates with goal-driven attention, top-down guided voluntary control. The imagination network is involved in constructing dynamic mental stimulations based on personal past experiences, on thinking about the future, and on imagining alternative perspectives and scenarios to the present. It is subserved by prefrontal cortex and temporal lobes. We also have executive attention network. It is recruited when a task requires that the spotlight of attention is focused like a laser beam. By the way, Ivan Pavlov also wrote about a beam of light describing attention. So this is subserved by lateral or outer regions of prefrontal cortex and areas toward the back or posterior of the parietal lobe. And the third network constantly monitors with both external event and the internal stream of consciousness, and is subserved by dorsal anterior cingulate cortices and anterior insula, and is important for dynamic switching between networks. It's a very important point. Switching between these networks is also subserved by a special neuronal mechanism. It's important to note then that when cognitive control is low, regions of the brain comprising for default mode network appear. The network, which includes specific parts of the brain, contributes to spontaneous thought generation and plays an important role in a creative behavior. To form such a creative behavior, one should allow the mind to roam free. You should diminish the role of executive attention network to activate imagination and to come to a so-called flow state. The brain somehow has prerequisites to feel the beauty as it is. It might be the beauty of arts or the beauty of a mathematical process. And special neuroscientific experimental research shows us similar mechanism of the brain that is active when a person perceives something beautiful, irrespective of the fact whether it's science or arts. To sum up, cognitive science will not make important steps without a paradigmatic breakthrough. We all feel it. We have tons and tons of experimental data. They appear every day. We do not know what to do with them. We should add a different perspective and use the data from higher manifestations of human genius. It's a very hard path. We should not only habitually, for us, register EEGs, evoked potentials, functional magnetic resonance, etc. We should study letters, drafts, and diaries of outstanding scholars and artists to peep into their mind processing. And I am ending with Wolfgang von Goethe, who wrote the same. Art is, in its analysis, destroys the unity of what it looks for. We should remember it. Coming to the end, I want to stress that truth is the daughter of time and not authority. We should be patient. We should wait. It's not a quick movement. And it's very important to put adequate questions. Francis Bacon, who helped me to start this talk, will help me to end this talk. He wrote that half of science is putting forth the right questions. I hope I, to a certain extent, of course, succeeded in my talk. And vielen Dank. And I want to shortly express what is on the picture. The picture shows the wind. One of the metaphors for consciousness and mind is the wind. You can never see the wind itself, as you can never see consciousness and mind itself. You can only see the consequences of their being active. So we hope that we succeed on this very difficult and slow road. Thank you. Vielen Dank again.